is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Issues of Faith. Talking about a tough topic for many people, grief. And we're happy to have with us an author who has experienced grief and who can help us deal with helping other people deal with their grief. She has written a new book, What Grieving People Wish You Knew, What Really Helps and What Really Hurts. And again, it's nice to have with us Nancy Guthrie, the author of this book. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ben.
All right. How did you come to write this book? This comes from a very personal place, doesn't it?
It does. My husband, David, and I have a son, Matt, and we also have two children, a daughter named Hope and a son named Gabriel, who were born with a rare metabolic disorder, and each of them lived only 6 months. And so, you know, I just had no sensitivity in regard to people with going through grief before that experience. But then once I had Hope and I knew my daughter was going to die, I would walk into places, I just saw people differently. And I also had the experience, really humbling experience of recognizing that I had just not reached out in the past to people going through grief. I just didn't know how much it hurts. I didn't understand how hard it is to be in social situations in the midst of grief, and you're wondering, is anybody going to mention it? Is everybody going to mention it? Am I going to burst out in tears? And that you process everything through that loss. And so that experience of loss gave me what I hope is an always increasing sensitivity to people in the midst of loss.
And I bet it had you, as you said, evaluate how you had treated others who had faced loss. And I would think I would not fare well. I would think I'm so worried about saying the wrong thing that often you say nothing.
Well, I remember looking at a person across the church one Sunday. It was at a time when I was feeling so sensitive about what people were saying or weren't saying, and my feelings were so easily hurt, and I was keeping tabs on people and the things they had said and didn't say. And then I look across the church and I see this friend whose mother had died before my daughter Hope was born, and I remembered how I never said anything to her because I assumed plenty of other people are saying something to her. She won't know if I say anything or not. And then a little bit of time went by. I bought her a card, but I never sent it, and I thought it would kind of make me look bad to send one late. So I was like, oh, just forget about it. And I remember sitting there in the midst of my grief over Hope and looking at her and just coming to tears. And I thought to myself, I wonder how many people I have hurt over the years by refusing to engage, by basically communicating to them by my silence that the person they loved didn't even merit a mention. And so that was very humbling to me.
So it's an uncomfortable thing.
It is. It's awkward, isn't it?
We're going on in our lives, and there's someone with this unspeakable grief. And so how do we enter into that?
Yeah.
You don't walk up and say, oh, how are you doing? That's our traditional greeting. How are you doing?
Yeah,
well, you know, they're doing horrible.
But why do we do that? We do that, I think, out of very good motives. We want to let them know, I know about this, and I care about how it's impacted you. But that's one of those questions that for grieving people, they often feel that that question means they have to give a report on how they're doing on this grief thing. You know, I'm 10% better than I was last week, when anyone who's been through grief knows that it is up and down, right? So what I suggest to people, instead of the very natural question, how are you, that we might ask perhaps a little bit more creative question, a question that presupposes that they are in the midst of grief, and that is to ask something like, what's your grief like these days? The difference that makes, Ben, is it does say, I expect you're grieving. How are you somehow says you should be over this by now. And we don't mean to say that, but sometimes we communicate by that question. There should be a steady upward of putting this behind you and not being affected by it. And a question like, what's your grief like these days? What that does is it opens up the person to say, you know, it's getting harder, or I'm incredibly lonely, or actually I'm doing better than I thought I might, and that makes me feel guilty, because does that mean I didn't even love that person? So it's a very open-ended question, but it still invites them to share with us about the person that they have lost.
At the beginning of the book, you say to those who are reading it, I applaud you for getting this book and for reaching out, for caring how to interact with someone who is grieving. You do lots of seminars and you meet with families who are grieving. I think the thing that worries people most when they want to interact with someone who's grieving is that they do harm.
Yes.
And so then again, I think they stay away.
So it's easier to avoid.
Just, you know, everybody else is reaching out, I'm going to stay back. When you talk to all of these other families and your personal situation, what does do harm?
Yeah.
What is hurtful?
Well, I think part of the problem is that we make the assumption that that we have to say something, or our desire is to say something meaningful, maybe something they haven't thought of before, something that somehow fixes it and makes it better. So I think it's helpful for us to realize the person who's grieving is not expecting really any of those things. They really just want someone to come alongside and agree with them that this is terribly sad and terribly hard, and that especially at first there's almost no way to make sense of it. It just hurts. And so to come alongside someone and not assume you've got to offer a piece of advice, do what comes very naturally to some of us is we begin telling the story about someone else we know who had something similar happen. I think we do that just because we're trying to fill up the awkward silence, or we begin telling a story about our own experience of loss. Once again, I think out of a desire to say, I relate to this, I get it. But if we put ourselves on the other side of that, we realize, you know, that we want our loss to be esteemed. And when we approach someone in the midst of loss and we begin giving advice, telling someone else's story, telling our own story, what it tends to do is communicate to that person, you know what, your loss isn't that big of a deal, everybody goes through this. And that person wasn't really that special because lots of people have died. So one way to think about approaching grieving people, if we want a foundational goal might be to esteem that person's grief and to not say anything that diminishes the person's grief.
Esteem their grief. That's interesting.
Yeah.
How do you esteem? I like that. But what do you mean specifically? Esteem their grief.
Well, let me say first how you might diminish it.
Oh yeah, okay.
Right?
Because that would be the negative, the opposite.
Right. So diminishing it is by telling other people's stories, or let people know that this is really very common, and it is, but that still doesn't esteem their grief.
Right.
To say you're going to be fine, that diminishes their grief. It's really not that big of a deal, right?
And how do you know they're going to be fine?
Yes, you don't.
You know.
To esteem it is to invite them to talk about that person. It says that person's worthy of us talking about and remembering. To esteem their grief means that we stay silent about telling our story about ourselves, or silent about giving advice. Advice giving, or saying you need to read this book, you need to take this pill, you need to go to this counselor. It sets it up as something to be managed, and what that person really desires is that you would esteem that this is perhaps the hardest thing they've ever been through, and that there are no simple, easy fixes to it, but that you want to humbly come alongside them and be sad with them over the enormous empty space that has been left behind by that person who has died.
And so listen to them.
Listen is very important. You know, I'm actually going to a funeral today, and I visited with this person on Saturday. And so you should probably know, I myself, I've written the book on it, I found it challenging to know what to say, and I found it challenging to simply listen. Because silence can be awkward. And, supposing myself the expert, I think I know what to say. And yet I just kept telling myself, inside myself, just listen to what he wants to say. Whatever it is he wants to talk about in the midst of that. Make that the priority. Honor him by listening. So that's a very important thing to do.
And the other thing I think people don't, and it's probably different, but the time frame. I mean, you hear when can you move on? And that term "move on."
Ooh.
But what is the time frame? Never ending, or I guess what are the stages and the time frame? And that term "move on."
Well, I've never believed in those stages. People like to talk about those stages of grief. And I think what those do to a grieving person is they say there's a process for this, and you can do it right or you can do it wrong. If you're doing it right, you go through these particular stages in this order or back and forth. So I just find grief is so unique to, different individuals. So what is key is just recognizing that those people need to be given the freedom to feel how they feel and express how they feel and to not have a timeline. But sometimes I hear people, especially people who've been through a loss, they'll say to someone fresh in their grief, you're always going to hurt. You're always going to feel this pain. And I think what they're trying to do is to say to that person, you'll never forget the person you love who has died. But to someone fresh in grief, feeling a level of pain, I remember the day after we put our daughter Hope's body into the ground, waking up the next day, I said to David, I think I understand for the first time in my life why people take drugs. I'd never understood it before because I'd never felt so much pain. I was willing to do almost anything to not have to feel it. So when we say to someone in those early stages of grief, you're always going to feel this. It's always going to be here with you. They begin to think, you mean this is my new normal? To feel this much pain? But the reality is, Ben, I believe in a God who revealed himself as Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. And so as we pray for people, that's what we say to people, right? Facebook, anywhere else, we say, I'm praying for you. Well, what is it that we're praying for them? We're praying that they'll experience comfort. We're praying that God will heal them in the midst of their brokenness and the grief. And the reality is, Ben, he does do that. As we invite him into the midst of our grief, he heals brokenness. And so while we continue to feel that loss, it doesn't mean that the grief has to stay as heavy as it once was. What I say to people as they're going through the midst of grief is at some point you're going to sense that perhaps you need to give the grief permission to lessen its hold on you, that it no longer has as much power over you to determine your emotions or your thought processes or what you feel like you're able to do or you can't do. And that as you experience that healing, the load lessens. Now what I find with grieving people is when the load does begin to lessen, maybe they begin to wake up and their first thoughts are not toward that person who dies. They actually feel guilty.
Right.
It can feel like a betrayal to the person who died.
You're not allowed to have happy
to not
day,
feel that heaviness, to actually experience joy and a lightness again, and to turn toward life rather than continuing to focus on the loss. So what I tell to people over and over again is that your love for the person who died is not measured by your level of misery.
All right, we have to take a break, and then I want to come back and talk about, you said that God alleviates this, but what about people that are angry and are questioning everything about their faith? So we'll take a break, we'll come back, continue the discussion, be back right after this.